Alrighty, friends, welcome back to History with Tim series, Historical Dirtbags. Now, on this series, we expose the worst figures in history, those who exploited power, privilege, for personal gain, regardless of the human cost. Today, we're delving into the story of a king who transformed a country into his own personal slave state, resulting in one of the worst humanitarian crises and crimes in modern history. Today, my friends, we will be talking about King Leopold II of Belgium. So, where do we start with this story? Well, let's start with, I guess we could say, the man. King Leopold II, you've probably heard of him as the ruler of Belgium during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But what you might not know is behind the facade of a European monarch, he was also responsible for orchestrating the deaths of millions in what would later become known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. How though? How through an imperial enterprise that was driven by greed veiled in humanitarian rhetoric and built on ruthless exploitation. Now, why did they give him the Congo? Like, how did he achieve it? You look at Belgium. Belgium's not that big a country. My great-grandfather was actually Belgian. He was from Belgium. He never really lived in Belgium, and he never really considered himself a Belgian once he arrived in the United States. But how was Leopold able to take such a large amount of land? Belgium, it's that big. It's not that big. Well, that brings us to a famous event, and we need to go back to 1884. To the Berlin Conference. This was when European powers, hungry for colonies and resources, met to carve up Africa. At this time, Leopold was already obsessed with building an empire, unlike the others European rulers who colonized under the national flag. Leopold, he had another idea. He wanted the Congo for himself. In 1885, he convinced the international community to let him rule over the Congo as a personal possession. Now, Leopold framed this, kind of like, oh, well, look at me, I'm the sweet old man, I just want to help the noble savages, pretty much. He claimed he would end the Arab slave trade, spread Christianity, and bring civilization back to Central Africa. He portrayed himself as a benevolent ruler to the world, and, the world bought it. Leopold even established organizations like the International African Association, under which he masked his real ambitions. The truth, however, was far darker. Now, when we did the Trevelyan video, we didn't really discuss his background, but why was Leopold like this? What was he really looking for? He was the second king of Belgium. Not only was he Leopold II, his father, Leopold I, was originally just a German prince who was given, and when I say prince, I don't mean his father was the king of Germany or anything like that. He was a prince from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which is also the royal family of England at this time, and the royal family related to the Kaiser in Germany and the Tsar in Russia. So he's from a pretty notable family that rules all over Europe. There's connections to Spain as well. So what was he really looking for in the Congo? Well, Leopold's actual goal was to extract as much wealth as possible from the Congo, especially in the form of rubber and ivory. By the late 19th century, the demand for rubber was skyrocketing due to the growth of the automobile industry and Leopold saw an opportunity. Now, under this, he was able to command Belgian officers and local chiefs to set up an extensive system of forced labor, where Congolese villagers were compelled to meet absurdly high quotas for rubber production. If they didn't, punishment was severe and, sadly, often fatal. Now, I know probably a lot of us don't know where rubber comes from. Rubber actually comes from a tree. It's actually a liquid that you siphon out and then you distill and such, and that's where you actually get rubber from. And this was a fortune in this era, because also, not only for automobiles, bicycles, the military started using rubber for their rifles as well as for handguns, and also, more importantly, boots. Rubber soles started becoming a more common thing. And the same thing in the private sector. Rubber was becoming a very high commodity. And ivory, as we know, even to this day, is a very sought after good. So this is pretty much what he was having done. He was extracting all of this to build not even Belgium's wealth, his own personal wealth, which is that much more egregious. The most notorious methods of punishment was mutilation, specifically the severing of hands. Belgian officers and mercenaries would cut off the hands of villagers who did not meet their quotas, or as a punishment for resistance. This brutal practice became a grim symbol of Leopold's reign, with piles of severed hands used as proof that bullets hadn't been wasted. An estimated 10 million people died due to these atrocities committed during Leopold's rule of the Congo. Now, let's please put that in retrospect for a second. 10 million. 10 million. We often agree with events like the Holocaust, probably around 12 million were killed. Events like the Great Leap Forward, about 50 to 60 million were probably killed. This is in the modern era, though. This is where we have a very big surge of population. Part of the reason for a country like China that enacted the one-child policy was because of the strain from losing so many people, and they were becoming overpopulated. 10 million in a tribal area in the late 19th, early 20th century is insane. And it's kind of, I took a history of genocide class in high school and in college. This is never even brought up, which is madness to me. This is probably one of the most atrocious genocides ever happened in history. And what makes it worse, it wasn't based on an ideology. It wasn't based on an idea of supremacy. It wasn't based on anything like that. It was based on one man's greed, which is just mind-boggling. But how do we know this? Because not everyone in Leopold's regime kept quiet, for one. People were seeing what was happening, and they're like, what? You can't be doing this to people. But also, by the 1890s, missionaries, the missionaries which everyone makes fun of, as the people that are insane, missionaries actually started going to the Congo because that's part of what Leopold promised, if we remember. Oh yeah, I'm going to bring Christianity to all these folks. But they started seeing what was going on, and they're like, you're a Catholic monarch. What are you doing? You can't be doing this. Journalists started going because, again, wherever you have a colony like this, you're going to have cities growing. I believe Mombasa is one of the big cities that started growing in the Congo. And even some Belgian officials were horrified by what they witnessed. One of the actually most famous whistleblowers was one Edmund Dean Morel, a British journalist. Morel worked for a shipping company that had handled trade between Belgium and the Congo, and he noticed something very odd about these shipments. While ships were coming back to Belgium full of rubber and ivory, the only thing being sent to the Congo were guns, chains, and reinforcements. Morel realized that this wasn't a colony exporting goods and receiving supplies in return. This was a regime of forced labor where the people were enslaved and brutalized. He started a campaign to expose the truth, founding the Congo Reform Association in 1904. And his writings gained international attention. Morel, along with, and we know this man very familiarly on this channel, Roger Casement, the Irish and English diplomat, documented the horrors through reports, photographs, and witness testimonies laying bare the atrocities of Leopold's regime. In 1903, Roger Casement, then British consul to Congo, conducted a meticulous investigation into the conditions there. His report, published by the British Parliament, described widespread torture, mutilation, and executions. Villagers testified that they were being beaten, starved, and forced to work under horrific conditions. Now, while all this is happening, because what's going on with Leopold? Like, what's happening in Belgium? Is he sitting there maniacally saying, yes, yes, the Congolese are doing exactly what I want? Or is he, just ignoring it, being like, oh, well, plausible deniability. I don't know what's actually happening. It is what it is. Well, dear old Leo was in fact building palaces. He became extremely wealthy from the profits generated from the Congolese rubber, using the blood money, literally, to finance public work projects in Belgium, such as the construction of Grand Arcade du Cinquantaire in Brussels, which still stands today. Which, again, this is what is going to make him seem like a benevolent ruler. Because he's trying to be like, I'm going to pay out of my pocket for the Belgian people. My pocket. No, I'm not going to charge the government. I'm going to do it. And you know what? The Belgians didn't care where the money was coming from. They were happy. The country was profiting. No one was really looking into it except people like Casement and Morel, because they were there and they were seeing it. Now, the cruelty wasn't exactly isolated. It was literally systematic. Leopold's regime was enforced by the Force Publique, a mercenary army that kept the population in line through terror. Villages were burned, women and children were taken hostage to ensure quotas were met, and entire communities, they were completely decimated by this. It's horrifying. And then with all these reports, finally you have the United States, which in the early 20th century is starting to take itself as a world power. We're taking over Puerto Rico and Cuba. We're kicking the Spanish out of Guam and the Philippines. England, the greatest empire on earth, is seeing this and being like, what's going on? France, which is one of the first European nations to end slavery and such, and even Germany, the German Empire, which is freshly made. People like Otto von Bismarck and even Wilhelm II are kind of like, what's going on here? Because you said one thing and clearly something else is happening. However, under pressure, Leopold was forced to relinquish his colony to the Belgian government. But this really wasn't out of remorse, more so from public pressure, and he didn't want his reputation being ruined, because again, he was doing this to be seen as benevolent. But he did everything in his power to destroy all evidence of the crimes, making sure that no one knew exactly what he did. He had records burned, documents were hidden, and statues were erected in Congo to show him as a great savior. But the damage had been done. The population of the Congo had decreased substantially due to the labor forces, the famine, disease, and violence. Historians estimate that between 10 to 15 million Congolese died during Leopold's reign. A catastrophe comparable to the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. And yet, Leopold died in 1909, still a king, still wealthy, and without facing justice for his crimes. Now, this is the heartbreaking reality. of people like Leopold is a lot of the times, and I mentioned this in the story of Trevelyan, a lot of times these guys aren't actually held to account. You know, even someone like the mustache guy in World War II, he killed himself. There was no justice. Sure, you had the Nuremberg trials and they were executed, but there was no justice. The architects got away with it. And you could debate, say, people like Adolf Eichmann and Hermann Goering and all these guys didn't. They were tried and everything. Goering killed himself. But the man who came up with the idea wasn't held to justice. The same thing with things like the Holodomor in the Soviet Union. Stalin was never held to account, and the same thing with the Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong was never held to an account. And this is the reality of these people. And, you know, the legacy of Leopold's brutality still haunts the Congo to this day. His reign of terror set the stage for decades of exploitation and suffering, with the scars still visible in the region. It's poverty, instability, and trauma. His name should not be remembered as a great builder of Belgium, but as a murderer and a thief. But sadly, sometimes justice comes too late. All right, friends, thank you today for joining us for Historical Dirtbags. Like I said, I like the series because I think these people need to be called out. You know, people talk about cancel culture all the time, and I agree. Some people probably should be held to account, but these people really need to be held to account. Because, like I said, you know, I'm Belgian by heritage, so I very much so need to. I want to face the wrongs of my heritage. You know, what the Belgians did in the Congo was atrocious. It was horrid. But with that said, that makes King Leopold II one of history's greatest dirtbags. He used humanitarianism as a cover for his greed. He created a system that brutalized millions. He ruled an African nation as his personal fiefdom, extracting unimaginable wealth at the expense of human lives. His empire was simply built on lies, terror, and death. And for that, he stands as one of the darkest figures in history. If you enjoyed that, please like, share, and comment. Love the comments, have the conversations. It's awesome. This is definitely one of my more favorite series to do. Thank you so much for joining us today on History of Tim's Historical Dirtbags. Please take a look at our History of Tim's Historical Preservation Fund. We're trying to help the national parks get through these tough times. Also, if you want to join this ever-growing community, we have a Patreon. We have a 5-tier system. You can be a private, you can be a sergeant, you could be a captain, a colonel, or you could be a marshal. That's right, we don't have generals here. We have marshals because they're cooler. But with that said, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you in the next one.